we are going to take a little page out of the Salt and Pepper playbook and talk about sex. And also, like that song that was released in 1991, we will be talking about ancient history. Our article comes from salon.com by Matthew Rosas, published on January 29th, 2023. And due to a little bit of content on this site, the link actually will not be down below. There is some imagery in there that YouTube might find a little bit exceptional. So if you go over to the Facebook fanbook page, you will see the link for it in there. And what we're going to be talking about is how sex was viewed by the ancient Egyptians, particularly some gods that, created or committed some autofellatio, as it were. And I guess the first question that I'm going to pose to the panel is, while reading this segment, this article, how does the morality of sex in history kind of compare to some of the morals that we see today? Aaron?
It's terrible. Religion likes to control sex for whatever reason. I'm not an expert. I haven't studied any of that. And this article certainly reinforced that the ancient Egyptians were just as conservative and controlling around sex as their contemporary neighbors in Israel at the time. They and we see that in religions today, and sex is a wonderful thing. It's fun, it's play, and it's a shame that religions make people feel shame and guilt about something that our bodies naturally do.
Yeah, and I've done a little bit of study on Egypt. It was like a class project back in third grade. We did a whole presentation. It was really interesting, and yeah, their ideas on nudity were also very different from what we have today, and a lot of that ideology of nudity and sex also arose in some of Victorian England. And so Rich, how do you feel about screwing over the rest of the world through Victorian England?
Don't blame the Victorians. Blame what people wrote about the Victorians and soon after Victorians. Now, the Victorians were a horny lot, actually. If you read, there are passages and letters written by Queen Victoria herself where she, let's just say, gleefully comments upon the manhood of her husband, Albert, because he was famously hung like a donkey. So that's why there's a ring named after him. It's how he used to control the beast. But there was all sorts of things you can find from the Victorian era that are extremely, let's just say, secular sexuality could do a whole episode on the Victorians and what they used to get up to, as opposed to what people used to write about and how they used to write. So don't blame the Victorians, blame the prudes who came after them. But it's an example of how often sex changes through history, and sex is written differently to what's actually going on. And one refreshing thing about the Egyptians is they just, for lack of a better phrase, put it all out there. It's like, this is what sex is, and this is what matters, and seem to have this very strong link with creation. The self-fellatioing God was the God who created the world, supposedly, and that's what creation was, which actually is a bit better than he said abracadabra and it happened because he was bored. So yeah, this is, actually, at least there's some kind of science to it. We know if that thing goes there, then creation happens. So maybe if that thing goes there, then creation happens. It's bad science, but at least it's better. And it's it's a great example of how sex changes over time. Those and the real Victorians, and any era you want to point out. The Greeks one, I'll get into those again. The Greeks were just sex crazy. They do anything to anything so long as certain rules were adhered to, involving giving and taking. Imaginations of a drive, I hope. And throughout history, there is no one way to have sex. Now, the religious thing is something that is very interesting. It seems to me to be tied up with religion because, of course, sex is about creating life, and it's about pleasure, and it's about all those things that if you can control them, you can control anything. If you can take that central aspect together, you can hold it. But I am with Stephen Fry on current views about sex. He said in, I think it was the Intelligence Squared debate, he said the Catholic Church, I'll use the Catholic Church as an example, but they're all like this. The Catholic Church, that sex is a bit like food. If you obsess about it, you probably have some kind of mental illness. And the Catholic Church obsess about sex all the time. They are basically the obese, the sexually obese, the Catholics. Yeah, and it's. But go and look at. There's some fantastic books about the history of sex. I won't mention them here for all sorts of reasons, but seek them out. Just go in your Google and put history of sex, and there's about 10 books, and all of them are awesome. The first 10, I guarantee you, are all awesome. And they'll blow your mind as to what people used to get up to in the Victorian eras, the Egyptians, the Greeks, the Romans, you name it. The Romans, it's just, wow. Have you seen Caligula? It's kind of accurate. But yeah.
And Aaron talked a little bit on the language of excluding homosexuality by the ancient Egyptians, and how that makes them possibly less tolerant. And does the ability to label something and give it recognition, is that what we have today that they don't have back then, and make it more palatable? Or could it potentially be causing some of the rift that we're just recognizing this now? What do you think, Scott?
Well, I think that we certainly see, people like having sex, people like doing the dirty deed, right? And so we shouldn't be surprised that this kind of thing pops up. We shouldn't be surprised that, pun intended, we shouldn't be surprised that the attitudes towards sex go up and down and in and out. Boy, it's a pun fest today, right? Because we've seen this kind of thing. We've already, Rich just gave us a bunch of examples. We got the Kama Sutra, right? It's one of the most famous sex books ever. I mean, that was right around the time when they were writing down in the Bible, talking about genitals like donkeys and emissions like horses and stuff like that. And so I think what we're seeing here is just normal human behavior. And so I think the fact that these societies are tying this sexual behavior and this sexual activity to their gods is just another point in favor of showing how gods are made in man's image and not the other way around. And so we give things that we're interested in, we might be interested in autofellatio, and so we'll have a god do that. We talked about how origin of the universe stories talk about ejaculation into the Nile and stuff like that. And that's stuff that people do. That's how people make other people, that kind of thing. And so it makes sense that it would see that. And so I think we shouldn't be surprised at any of this from this story. I mean, it totally fits in with the crashing waves up and down, the repetitive nature of human behavior and human history. We should expect to see this. And you know what? It's probably going to happen again too. They're probably going to find, some future civilization might find some of our, images of sexuality and say, oh boy, we're what's happened? They were just either so prudish or so way out there, depending on what they're from. And so it's just all part of being a person.
Yeah, I don't think that religion in general has a problem with sex, because the Bible says, go forth and multiply. Scott, you mentioned the Kama Sutra, which is coming from very Hindu ideas. And I was lucky enough to be able to travel around a little bit, and, like the Japanese, when they go about their business, they're very kind of like sexually repressed people societally, but when the sun goes down, the hair comes down. Oh man, does it get kind of nuts. I mean, if you've ever got a chance to see a fertility festival, it would make some sailors blush. Let's just put it that way. And so religion in general doesn't have a problem with sex. I think religion has a problem with types of sex. And with Christianity, I think they're trying to take, and we do see it, a more reproductive view of sex, that it should only be for reproduction, because when you don't have a lot of humans around, you want to make sure that the survival of the species continues, the survival of the tribe continues. And that's where we see that, oh, no, you shouldn't engage in the types of sex that would be unproductive or unreproductive, as it were, and that you should only do these very, very specific acts. And I think that's where that is coming from. Anybody can go ahead and correct me if I'm wrong, but what do you think about that, Aaron?
Yeah, I think that's a really good point, that the religion wants to control the type of sex you have. It's almost, in my experience, they kind of want to have their cake and eat it too. I grew up a Christian, and as a member of the Mormon Church, the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, and they had a little pamphlet that they gave to all the youth, that, and one of the topics of that little pamphlet is sexual purity, chastity. And it was, all the time, frequently drilled into us that no sexual relations before marriage, and that includes masturbation, that includes any kind of sexual activity with a member of the opposite sex, and heaven forbid a member of the same sex. And nobody ever came out and said, "Yo, you're a bad person if you don't follow these rules." But you internalize that message. You internalize that message that so sex must be bad. There must be some reason why, and you feel guilt and shame when, of course, you're going to masturbate when you're growing up. Everybody does. It's natural. It's normal. You're going to feel guilty when you engage in sexual activity with somebody that you're not married to, and that just feeds on itself. And then when you're finally able to have sex, then you have this fear, this shame, and this guilt around it that's been built up, and that's been my experience.
So this particular article doesn't really come up with any kind of conclusion, but if we were to kind of give a conclusion to the idea of this, with all the imagery that we see in this particular article, which again you can only access from Facebook, with kind of imagery and ideology that they had with the gods having sex and all that, does that make Egypt more or less freaky? Scott, what do you think?
Well, one thing it shows us is that their gods were definitely well endowed and were some badass contortionists. I'll tell you that, because I'm sure any bored teenager with a penis can tell you that that's a difficult position, or so I'm told.
Yeah.
To maintain. It's
easier
just
for some than others.
Right. And so there's definitely a freak factor going on there. I will also throw in that this god that was from this picture, Geb, the earth god, has a sister / consort by the name of Nut. Take from that what you will.
Rich, what do you think?
The Egyptians married their sisters all the time. I think Cleopatra, who wasn't even really Egyptian, she was Greek, but she still married her brother at one point until she met the Romans, the powerful one who got killed, and the other one who again had a massive, apparently. So it seems to be a running theme in the history of sex: men who are very well endowed. Maybe I'll appear in history, but anyway, it is an interesting fact that often how an attitude to sex is shaped around a culture and shaped around a culture's understanding of hierarchy. And so are their gods. there's this link there. So in Egyptians, you've got these very sexualized gods, these ideas of creation, of how sex leads to things coming into existence, and so the gods obviously partook in it. In the Greeks, they have a very much a structure of a kind of a great chain of being, where you have the gods at the top of pure reason, followed by men, followed by women and young boys. And so that's the direction that sex can happen. So the gods could have sex with whoever they wanted, men could have sex with women and young men, and young men can only really have sex with young men. But that's the Greeks, and that's how they saw the structure of the world, and that's so their gods reflect their society, and their society reflects their gods. And so you get to Christianity, where you have God who's basically a boring prude who doesn't want even people to eat an apple, and so people can't even bear fruit unless it's for children. And
For
it
the
is
tribe.
you'll find the Kama Sutra. Karma is one of the four great desires of Hinduism. It's the desire that is for worldly material stuff, and it is an important desire, but they wrote down this is how you should do it properly, because it's not the most important desire. That, of course, is karma as opposed to karma. Very easy to get it mixed up. Karma as in karma, kama as in kama, and of course your path as well is very important. So again, their society saw things as this is the path, this is the way you should do things, this is how you should handle things. And sex will always be a reflection. How we understand sex will always be a reflection of how our society understands sex, and our gods will always be an understanding of that as well. So I'd love to see the secular sexuality god. I'm picturing it now.
Aaron, what do you think about the freaky nature of Egyptians?
I think everybody's freaky. I think we just don't talk about it. I think if we were more open about talking about sex, I think you'd find there's a lot of freaky people out there that like a lot of freaky things and want to do more freaky things, but they feel like it's their God doesn't want them to do it. Or it's really interesting. The language around sex involves dirty talk or being naughty. It's really interesting that we use those words around sex when sex is neither of those things.
I mean, one could make the argument of, if sex isn't dirty, then you're not doing it right. But that's neither here or there. So we are pretty much at the end of the show. And I want to thank each and every last one of you for joining us. And I want to thank our audience members for sitting through all these discussions with us. If you would like to support the show, you can do so by becoming a patron at tiny.cc/PatreonNP.